The lights in the conference room dimmed. The projector flickered on. And the moment the first slide appeared, my entire body went cold. I was standing near the back of the room, holding a glass of water I hadn't touched. I hadn't been invited to this event. I'd found out about it by accident, a forwarded email from an old contact who thought I already knew. But I hadn't known. Not until right now. There was my sister, Carla, standing on that stage with the confidence of someone who had worked for years on something important. She smiled at the crowd. She adjusted her clicker. And then she started talking. My words came out of her mouth. My diagrams filled the screen behind her. My opening line, the exact line I had written at my kitchen table 11 months ago, echoed through the speakers. The world doesn't need another app, she said. It needs a smarter system. I said that first. I wrote that first. I sketched the system she was now presenting to a room full of investors and journalists who had no idea. My hands were shaking. I set the glass down before I dropped it. I whispered, "That's mine." Nobody heard me. The audience clapped. I pushed through the side door and walked straight to the parking lot. My legs were moving, but I wasn't really telling them to. I sat in my car and stared at the steering wheel for a long time. My phone kept buzzing. People I hadn't heard from in months were suddenly texting, congratulating Carla, sharing the press release, calling her a visionary. One message said she was redefining how businesses manage data pipelines. That was my phrase. I had written it in my notebook during a late night in my garage, circled it 3 times, and shown it to her over the phone. She had said, "Oh, I love that." Now it was hers. I called her. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I sat there replaying every meeting, every draft, every conversation where I had trusted her with pieces of this idea. There had been so many of them. I had been so open. I thought that was what family did, shared things, helped each other. But as I sat in that parking lot with my phone lighting up with congratulations meant for her, one thought kept pushing through everything else. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned. She hadn't stumbled into my idea. She had studied it. My name is Nathan Reeves. I'm 58 years old. I spent most of my career working in the background. Database systems, workflow automation, back-end infrastructure, the kind of work that keeps companies running but never makes anyone famous. I was good at it. I was careful and thorough, and I showed up every single day. But I wasn't flashy. I never had the gift for selling myself the way some people do. When I was 55, the company I had worked at for 14 years downsized. They gave me a box, a handshake, and a severance package that lasted 8 months. After that, I was on my own. I spent a year consulting. Small projects, short contracts. Enough to pay the bills, but nothing close to what I had built before. And then one evening, I sat down at my desk with a legal pad and started writing out an idea I had been turning over in my mind for 2 years. A smarter system for small businesses to manage their data pipelines without needing a full tech team. Simple on the outside, powerful underneath. The kind of tool I had always wished existed. It took me 4 months to build the first prototype. It took my sister 4 minutes to decide she wanted it for herself. It was a Tuesday evening in October, about 14 months before her launch. Carla came over for dinner, which wasn't unusual. She did that once or twice a month. After we ate, I showed her what I had been working on. I pulled up the prototype on my laptop and walked her through it step by step. I remember feeling proud. I had fixed a major bug the week before, and the system was finally running clean. She leaned in close to the screen. She asked questions, good questions, the kind that showed she understood what she was looking at. She asked about the algorithm that sorted incoming data. She asked how the dashboard updated in real time. She took out her phone and, I thought, wrote down a few notes to remember what I had told her. Before she left, she hugged me at the door. "I'm proud of you," she said. "Really, Nathan. This could be huge." I smiled. I felt seen. I felt like for once, someone in my family actually understood what I was trying to do. I watched her drive away and went back inside to keep working. I didn't know she wasn't just watching me build something. She was studying it. Every question she asked that night was not curiosity. It was research. 3 months after that dinner, I finished polishing the pitch. I had a working prototype, a clean slide deck, and a simple, honest explanation of the problem I was solving. I felt ready. Through a contact at a networking event, I got a 30-minute meeting with Alan Keller. He was not the biggest name in venture capital, but he was respected. He had backed 3 companies in the last 5 years that had gone on to succeed quietly but steadily, exactly the kind of investor I was looking for. I walked into his office on a gray Thursday morning and gave the best presentation of my life. He listened carefully. He didn't check his phone. He asked sharp questions about the tech behind the dashboard, about how the sorting algorithm handled edge cases, about my plan for getting small businesses set up without a technical team on their side. At the end, he leaned back in his chair and said, "The timing's not quite right for us." I thanked him and left. But on the way to my car, something stayed with me. He hadn't looked bored. He hadn't dismissed me politely the way investors do when they've already decided no. He had looked genuinely curious, like someone who was still thinking. After the meeting with Alan Keller, Carla started calling more often. At first, I thought it was just normal. We had always had a decent relationship, not close but steady. She would check in every few weeks. But now she was calling twice a week, sometimes more. She asked how the search for investors was going. She offered to introduce me to people, though none of those introductions ever led anywhere. One contact she gave me didn't return a single email. Another agreed to a call, then rescheduled 4 times and finally disappeared. She also suggested I slow down on the pitch and refine it more. "Don't rush it," she said. "Investors can smell desperation." She sent me articles about failed startups that had launched too early. She encouraged me to wait another quarter before approaching anyone new. I listened. I trusted her. She was my sister, and she seemed genuinely invested in my success. But looking back now, I understand exactly what she was doing. She was buying time. Every week I waited was a week she used to get further ahead. Every introduction that went nowhere was one less door I could walk through. She wasn't helping me build my future. She was carefully, quietly, making sure I couldn't. Her launch event was held at a venue downtown on a Friday evening. Invitation only. I found out about it at 11 o'clock the night before, through a forwarded email from an old contact named Frank, who assumed I already knew and thought he was just confirming the time. I was not on the guest list. That detail hit me harder than almost anything else. It wasn't just that she had taken the idea. It wasn't just that she had found the investor I had pitched to and convinced him to back her instead. It was that she had gone through the trouble of making sure I wouldn't be in the room. She had thought about me specifically. She had considered the possibility that I might show up and say something. And she had taken steps to prevent it. She removed me from the guest list the same way she had removed my name from the story. I went anyway. I walked in through a side entrance, told the person at the door I was a guest of a journalist who had already gone in, and they let me through without checking twice. And that's how I ended up standing at the back of that room, holding a glass of water, watching my sister present my life's work to a crowd that had never once heard my name. I drove to my parents' house the next morning. I needed to talk to someone. I needed someone who had known both of us our whole lives to look me in the eye and say, "Yes, this is wrong. Yes, you deserve better than this." My mother opened the door. She already knew why I was there. Carla must have called ahead. We sat in the living room. My father kept his eyes on the floor. My mother held her coffee cup with both hands and chose her words carefully. "She saw an opportunity," my mother said. "She just moved faster than you did." "It was my idea," I said. "She didn't create anything. She took what I built and put her name on it." My father finally looked up. "Nathan, you know how Carla is. She's always been quick. Maybe this is just." "She stole from me," I said. The room went quiet. My mother set down her cup. "We're not going to call it that." "Then what are you going to call it?" She didn't answer. My father looked back at the floor. I sat there for another minute, waiting for one of them to say something different. They didn't. I stood up, thanked them for the coffee I hadn't touched, and left. 2 days after I visited my parents, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the name that came up on the screen was one I knew. Conrad Webb, Carla's husband. Conrad was a corporate lawyer. The kind who wore expensive suits and spoke in a calm, unhurried way that made everything he said sound reasonable, even when it wasn't. I answered. "Nathan," he said. "How are you doing?" "I've been better," I said. "I understand." He paused, the kind of pause that lawyers use to let silence do some of the work. "I just wanted to reach out, one family member to another. Carla is very excited about her company. She's worked hard to get here. I'd hate to see anything complicate that." "Are you threatening me?" I asked. "Not at all," he said, still perfectly calm. "I'm just saying that these situations can get messy. Allegations of stolen intellectual property are hard to prove, and they tend to damage the person making the claim just as much as the person being accused. Sometimes more." He paused again. "I hope you'll think carefully before doing anything you can't undo." He said goodbye and hung up. I held the phone in my hand for a long time after that. They weren't worried. They were completely confident I wouldn't fight back. For the next 2 weeks, I barely left my garage. I sat at my workbench surrounded by notebooks, printed drafts, and the old prototype I had first shown Carla 14 months ago. I stared at all of it. I had timestamps, handwritten notes, early code builds with dates, enough to show clearly that I had built this first. But Conrad's words kept circling in my head. Hard to prove. Damages the accuser. Messy. I was 58 years old. I had limited savings. I had no legal team and no PR person and no family standing behind me. Carla had a husband who knew the law, an investor with deep pockets, and a press release already calling her a visionary. For the first time since all of this started, I sat back in my chair and let myself think the thing I had been avoiding. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had been too slow, too quiet, too careful. Maybe people like me, the ones who build things in garages without fanfare, weren't meant to be the ones who got the credit. Maybe this was just how the world worked. I sat with that thought for a long time. And then I picked up my laptop to watch her demo video one more time. That's when I saw it. I had watched the demo video twice already, but both times I had been too angry to pay close attention. This time I slowed down. At the 4-minute mark, she demonstrated how the system handled a spike in incoming data, what happened when a business suddenly received 10 times its usual load. The dashboard was supposed to flag the spike, reroute the overflow, and send an automatic alert to the user. In her demo, it worked smoothly. Too smoothly. That function didn't fully work when I last had the code. I had identified the problem 6 months before her launch. The rerouting algorithm had a flaw that caused it to crash under pressure. It was the one thing I hadn't fixed before she took the idea. I leaned forward in my chair. If she had truly built this from scratch, she would have hit that same wall. She would have had to solve the problem herself. But there was no sign of that in the demo, no workaround, no modified approach. The system behaved exactly the way mine did before I discovered the flaw, which meant one thing. She hadn't fixed it. She had simply hidden it. She had recorded the demo under controlled conditions, low volume, no real stress on the system. She was showing investors something that didn't fully work yet. And sooner or later, that was going to matter. I closed the laptop and sat very still. I went back to the notes I had taken after my meeting with Alan Keller. I had written down his questions word for word, the way I always did after any important meeting, a habit I had kept since the early days of my career. He had asked about the rerouting algorithm. He had asked specifically about what happened under a high data load. He had asked how the system would behave if a client suddenly scaled up overnight. These were not general questions. These were the exact questions someone would ask if they had thought carefully about the weakest part of the system. At the time, I had taken them as a sign of his intelligence. Now I understood something else entirely. He had been evaluating risk. He was looking for the flaw, and he had found it in my pitch. So when Carla came to him, she didn't come with a better idea. She came with a shinier presentation and a demo that hid the very problem he had already spotted. He hadn't backed her because he believed in her. He had backed her because he believed in the idea, my idea. He just didn't know the version he was funding had a crack running straight through its foundation. If he knew that, everything would change. That night, I made a decision. I was done feeling sorry for myself. I was done waiting for my family to admit what had happened, or for the world to notice on its own. Neither of those things was coming. I was not going to confront Carla again. She had shown me exactly who she was the moment she leaned in backstage and said you had your chance. There was nothing left to say to her. I was not going to call Conrad back. I had nothing to prove to a man who called to warn me off with smooth words and careful pauses. And I was not going to argue with my parents anymore. They had made their choice. I couldn't change it. I didn't have the energy to keep trying. What I was going to do was rebuild. Not the same version. A better one. A version that fixed every flaw, including the one she was hiding. A version so clean and so clearly documented that there would be no room for confusion about who had built it, or when, or why. I was going to do it quietly. No announcements. No looking over my shoulder at what she was doing. I was going to focus only on what was directly in front of me. And when the time was right, I would be ready. I started over from the first line of code. Not because I had to, the original system was still solid, but because starting over forced me to understand every piece of it again. And this time, I documented everything. Every decision I made, every version I saved, every test I ran, all of it timestamped, labeled, backed up in 3 separate places. I worked from 6 in the morning until midnight, 7 days a week. I ate simple meals. I stopped reading news about Carla's company. I stopped looking at the press coverage. I turned off the part of my brain that wanted to compare and pointed it toward building instead. The rerouting flaw was the first thing I fixed. I spent 11 days on it. I tried 4 different approaches before I found one that held. When I finally ran the stress test and watched the system handle 10 times its normal load without a single crash, I sat back and let myself breathe for the first time in weeks. Then I kept going. I tightened the dashboard. I improved the onboarding flow. I made the system faster, cleaner, and simpler to use. I added features I had always wanted but never had time for. I wasn't chasing her anymore. I was surpassing her. About 3 months into the rebuild, I reached out to Frank Osei. Frank and I had worked together years ago at a mid-sized tech firm. He had been a senior systems engineer, one of the few people in my career I genuinely respected. We had stayed in loose contact over the years. The occasional email, a message when one of us changed roles. Nothing close. But Frank was honest, and that was what I needed most right now. I asked if he would look at what I had built. No backstory, no context. Just the system itself. He agreed to meet at a coffee shop near his office on a Tuesday afternoon. I showed him the prototype. I walked him through the core features. He didn't say much while I was presenting. He just watched, clicked through the interface, and ran a few test inputs on his own laptop. When I finished, he leaned back and looked at me. "This is stronger than anything I've seen on the market right now," he said. "Who else has looked at this?" I gave him the short version of the story. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know someone you should talk to, but you need to approach it the right way." He slid a business card across the table. The card had one name on it, Alan Keller. Frank explained that he had worked with Alan on a due diligence review 2 years earlier and had stayed in contact. He offered to send a brief introduction, nothing detailed, just enough to get my foot in the door. I sat with it for 2 days before I said yes. Going back to the same investor who had turned me down, and who had since funded Carla, felt like walking into a room where everyone already knew how the last visit had ended. I would have one shot. If I came in wrong, I would lose it. But I also knew something Alan Keller didn't know yet. I knew his current investment had a flaw he hadn't discovered. I knew the person he had backed didn't fully understand the system she was running. And I knew my version was better, not slightly better, noticeably better, and I had the evidence to prove every word of it. Frank sent the introduction. 3 days later, Alan's assistant called and offered a time slot. I stood in my kitchen when I took that call. I wrote down the date. I thanked her and hung up. Then I went back to my garage and kept working. I was not going to walk into that room anything less than completely ready. I arrived at Alan Keller's office 12 minutes early. The building was the same one I had been to 18 months before. Same front desk, same elevator, same view of the street from the waiting area. The only thing different was me. When Alan came out to meet me, he shook my hand and said, "I remember you." Not warmly, not coldly. Just as a fact. "I remember you too," I said. We sat in the same conference room. I set up my laptop and opened the presentation. This time, I didn't try to sell him on the idea. He already knew the idea. What I did instead was show him the system, the actual system, running live, handling real test data. I walked him through the rerouting algorithm. I showed him how it performed under genuine pressure. I showed him the documentation, every version, every timestamp, every decision log going back 22 months. I spoke slowly. I didn't rush. I let the work do the talking. Halfway through, he put down his pen. He leaned forward in his chair. He didn't say anything yet, but I recognized the look on his face. It was the same look he had worn in our very first meeting, right before he asked about the rerouting algorithm. He was thinking again. He let me finish before he spoke. When I closed the laptop, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at me. "Why does this feel more complete than what I've seen before?" he said. I had prepared for that question. "Because this version is," I said. "The system you've been looking at has a flaw in the rerouting algorithm. Under a real data load, not a demo, an actual client workload, it will crash. I found that problem 14 months ago. I've spent the last 3 months fixing it." I let that sit in the air between us. Alan didn't react immediately. He was the kind of man who thought before he spoke, which I respected. He picked up his pen and turned it slowly in his fingers. "You're saying the version currently on the market is broken," he said. "I'm saying it hasn't been tested under real conditions," I said carefully. "And when it is, it won't hold. And yours will." "Yes." He nodded once, very slightly. "I'd like to see the documentation," he said. "All of it. Timestamps, version history, everything." "I brought it," I said. I opened my folder and placed it on the table between us. Something had shifted in that room. I could feel it. While I waited to hear back from Alan, I started paying closer attention to what was happening with Carla's company. I hadn't looked at her press coverage in months, not since I made the decision to focus entirely on rebuilding. But now I looked again. And what I found was subtle, but unmistakable. The launches she had announced were delayed. A product update that was supposed to go live in October had been pushed to December with no public explanation. A partnership she had celebrated in the spring was no longer mentioned anywhere on her website. In the comment sections of tech forums, early users were beginning to raise questions. Loading errors, syncing failures, data that disappeared and didn't come back. Nothing catastrophic yet, nothing that would make headlines, but the kind of cracks that spread quickly if you don't address them fast. Her team was growing restless. 2 engineers had quietly updated their profiles to say they were open to new opportunities. That was the polite way of saying they were looking for a way out. And Alan Keller, I imagined, was starting to notice all of it. Investors at his level don't just check in at the beginning. They watch. They track every milestone, every delay, every public statement. They compare what founders promise to what founders actually deliver. And Carla was starting to come up short. Alan called me 10 days after our meeting. He said he wanted to see the documentation again, specifically the early version history, the dates on the first prototype builds, and the notes from my original pitch preparation. I brought everything. We sat across from each other in the same conference room, but the feeling was different this time. Less like a pitch, more like a careful review. He went through the folder page by page. He read slowly and made small marks in the margins of his own notepad. He didn't ask many questions. I didn't push. I answered what he asked and let him take his time. At one point, he stopped on a page that showed the exact date I had first demonstrated the prototype, October of the previous year. He tapped it lightly with his pen and looked at me over his glasses. I met his eyes and held them. He turned the page. By the time we finished, the folder was sitting in the center of the table between us, covered in his notes. He closed his notepad and set it to one side. "I appreciate your thoroughness," he said. He didn't say anything else that day. But when I walked out to the elevator and pressed the button, I was certain of one thing. He had connected every single. The call came on a Wednesday morning. I was in my garage, running another stress test on the system, when my phone rang. The number was Alan's direct line. Not his assistant's, not the main office number. His. I answered on the second ring. "Nathan," he said. "Can you come in this afternoon?" "Yes," I said. I arrived at 3 o'clock. He was alone in the conference room when I walked in, no assistant, no associate, just him. He stood up and shook my hand, which he hadn't done at the end of our last meeting. We sat down. He folded his hands on the table. "I think I backed the wrong founder," he said. He said it plainly, and without drama. Not an apology. Alan Keller didn't seem like a man who apologized easily. Just a direct statement of what he had concluded after reviewing everything. I waited. "The documentation you brought is clear," he said. "The timeline is clear. And the technical gap between what I funded and what you've built is..." He paused. "It's significant." "Yes," I said. "I don't make decisions like this lightly, Nathan. Pulling support from a company I've backed is not something I do without being completely certain." He looked at me steadily. "I'm certain," he said. "What do you want? Not what you deserve. What do you actually want?" I had thought about that question many times over the past months. In my lowest moments, what I had wanted was for Carla to publicly admit what she had done. I had wanted my parents to look me in the eye and say they believed me. I had wanted the articles to be rewritten with my name instead of hers. But I had let those things go. Not because they didn't matter, but because I had learned that waiting for other people to hand you back your dignity is a slow and painful way to live. You cannot force someone to see what they have already decided not to look at. What I wanted now was simpler and more solid. "I want a partnership," I told Alan. "Formal, documented, with full control over the product direction. I want the IP ownership made completely clear from the start, no ambiguity whatsoever. And I want her backing transferred away from her company and into mine." Alan listened without interrupting. "Those are reasonable terms," he said. "I'm not asking for anything beyond what was always mine," I said. He picked up his pen and opened his notepad to a clean page. "Then let's talk about the structure," he said. We talked for 2 more hours. When I left his office that evening, the sky had gone dark. I sat in my car and closed my eyes. Something real had just begun. I don't know exactly when Alan told Carla. I wasn't in the room for that conversation, and I didn't ask him to describe it afterward. What I know is that it happened on a Thursday, 5 days after our meeting, and that by Friday morning, her company's status page had gone offline without notice. By the following Tuesday, 2 things had happened publicly. The engineering firm she had contracted for server management posted a notice saying their work for her company was under review pending payment. And a journalist who covered the startup space posted a short question on a tech forum. Had anyone heard from Carla's company recently? He had received word of internal turbulence. That was the beginning of the unraveling. Then my phone rang. Carla's name was on the screen. She had not called me in 4 months. Not since the launch. Not since I had shown up at the event. Not since our conversation backstage, where she told me I never would have pulled it off anyway. I looked at the phone. It rang 7 times before it stopped. Then it rang again. I turned the phone face down on my workbench and went back to what I was doing. There was nothing she could say that I needed to hear right now. My work wasn't finished yet. She came to my house on a Saturday. I heard the knock just after 8 in the morning, 3 sharp raps, nothing like the easy way she used to knock when she stopped by for dinner. I opened the door and found her standing on the step in a coat that looked like she had grabbed it on the way out. Her hair wasn't done the way she always kept it. There were shadows under her eyes. She looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. "How could you do this to me?" she said. No hello. No asking to come inside. Just those words, delivered the way people deliver sentences they have been rehearsing in the car the whole drive over. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about everything I could say. There was a great deal I could have said. "You mean," I said slowly, "what you did to me?" She opened her mouth and closed it again. "You took my idea," I said. "You presented it as yours. You found my investor, convinced him to back you instead of me, and then made sure I wasn't even in the room when you launched. You did all of that, Carla." She looked down at the step. "I needed this," she said quietly. "So did I said. I stepped back and closed the door. My company launched 8 months later on a quiet Tuesday morning. No gala. No press release calling me a visionary. No invitation-only event with expensive drinks and journalists. Just a clean website, a working product, and a short announcement sent to a list of small business owners who had signed up to hear from me over the previous months. Within the first month, 400 companies had created accounts. Within 3 months, That number had grown past 2,000. The system held. The rerouting algorithm held under real workloads, with real clients, under real pressure. Everything performed exactly the way I had always believed it would. Alan's support helped, but it wasn't the whole story. The product was simply good, the kind of good that only comes from building something slowly and honestly, without cutting corners or hiding flaws or pretending to be further along than you actually are. I saw an article about Carla's company a few weeks after my launch. The company had dissolved following investor withdrawal and unresolved legal claims from contractors. She was not quoted. There was no photograph. I read it once and didn't go back. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel the satisfaction I had once imagined I would feel. I mostly felt a quiet kind of peace, the kind that doesn't come from winning, but from knowing you didn't become someone you're ashamed of in order to survive. She built something on stolen ground. It was always going to fall.